5:30 in the morning, the Gulf of Oman. The aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan was currently maintaining a steady course of 180 degrees, cutting through the heavy swells of the Arabian Sea at a speed of 20 knots. The massive nuclear-powered vessel, displacing 97,000 tons, moved with a deceptive grace despite the rising seas. The carrier strike group had transitioned to modified battle stations 4 hours earlier, following high-priority intelligence reports from Pacific Command regarding increased underwater activity originating from the Iranian naval base at Bandar Abbas. The air above the flight deck was thick with the heavy scent of JP-5 aviation fuel and the humid, cloying salt of the Indian Ocean. Low-hanging clouds obscured the stars, leaving the horizon a blurred line of charcoal and black. On the 4.5-acre flight deck, the yellow-shirted handlers moved with practiced efficiency, securing a flight of 4 FA-18 Super Hornet fighters that had just returned from a long-range combat air patrol. The deck vibrated with the low, rhythmic hum of the carrier's 2 A4W nuclear reactors, providing the immense power required to keep the city at sea alive and vigilant. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was cooled to a precise 68 degrees to protect the sensitive electronics of the ship's nervous system. The room was bathed in the soft blue and green glow of dozens of tactical consoles. Watch officers stood behind the seated operators, their eyes scanning the complex symbology of the ANSPY-6 radar system. At coordinates 24 degrees 35 minutes north, 58 degrees 22 minutes east, the Reagan was entering the most restricted portion of the transit corridor. Every sensor on the ship and its surrounding escorts was pushed to its maximum operating limit. Every sensor on the ship and its surrounding escorts was pushed to its maximum operating limit. To the west, the destroyer USS Halsey, a DDG-51 Arleigh Burke-class vessel, maintained a station 5,000 yards off the carrier's port bow. The Halsey was currently operating its SQS-53C sonar in active mode, sending powerful pulses of sound into the deep, dark water. The sonar pings returned with mechanical regularity, mapping the thermal layers and the rugged topography of the ocean floor. The crew of the Halsey was looking for a ghost, a silent predator known to be lurking somewhere in these waters, an Iranian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine. The commanding officer of the Reagan stood on the bridge, his hands gripped tightly behind his back as he stared through the thick, armored glass at the dark water ahead. He knew that the Iranian Tareq-class boats were among the quietest in the world when running on battery power. They were designed specifically for these shallow, cluttered waters where the temperature gradients and the noise of commercial shipping could hide a 1,000-ton hull with ease. The mission was one of deterrence and freedom of navigation, but the tension on the bridge was a physical weight that every sailor could feel. 3 miles to the rear, the cruiser USS Shiloh, a CG-67 Ticonderoga-class vessel, monitored the air corridors and the surface tracks of several dozen merchant tankers. The Shiloh was the primary air defense commander for the strike group, its Mark 41 vertical launch systems loaded with over 120 Evolved Sea Sparrow and Standard missiles. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the strike group, the primary threat this morning was not coming from the sky or the surface. It was coming from the crushing depths below, where the rules of engagement were often written in seconds rather than minutes. The strike group was currently 60 miles south of the Iranian coastline, well within the range of land-based anti-ship cruise missiles, but the electronic warfare suites were already radiating, creating a complex web of deception. The crew had been at this level of readiness for 72 hours, and the strain was beginning to show in the tired eyes of the young sailors in the galleys and the engine rooms. They were professionals, trained to the highest standards of the United States Navy, yet they all understood the fundamental truth of naval warfare. The ocean was a vast, unforgiving environment that favored the hidden over the seen. As the clock ticked toward 5:45 in the morning, a subtle change occurred in the acoustic environment. The sonar operator on the USS Halsey leaned forward, pressing his headphones tighter against his ears. He filtered out the mechanical whine of the Reagan's 4 massive propellers and the constant slapping of waves against the hull. There was something else out there, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound that did not belong to the sea or the merchant fleet. It was a transient noise, lasting less than 2 seconds, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. The Iranian Kilo-class submarine, Tareq, sat motionless at a depth of 120 meters, nestled just below a sharp thermal gradient known as the layer. At this depth, the water temperature dropped 6 degrees in less than 10 meters, creating a physical boundary that reflected sonar waves back toward the surface like a mirror. The submarine was operating on its massive lead-acid batteries, its diesel engines silent, and its cooling pumps running at their lowest possible revolutions. To the sonar operators on the surface, the 1,000-ton vessel was effectively invisible, masked by the natural acoustic clutter of the Gulf of Oman. Inside the cramped, dimly lit pressure hull, 52 sailors moved with practiced, surgical silence. Their soft-soled shoes made no sound against the steel decking, and every hatch was operated with extreme care to avoid the sharp metallic click that could give away their position. The air inside the Tareq was heavy and stale, smelling of recirculated oxygen, hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, chemical tang of ozone from the battery banks. The temperature in the command center remained at a stifling 28 degrees, but the crew remained focused on their consoles, their faces illuminated by the pale orange glow of the instrumentation. The commanding officer of the Tareq stood behind the sonar supervisor, his eyes fixed on the rolling waterfall display of the passive sonar system. He did not need active pings to find his target. The USS Ronald Reagan, with its 4 massive bronze propellers and dozens of auxiliary pumps, was generating a sound signature that could be heard for 50 miles. On the screen, the carrier appeared as a thick, bright line of acoustic energy, accompanied by the sharper, faster signatures of the escorting destroyers. The commander knew that the American ships were searching for him, but he also knew that the thermal layer was his greatest ally. At 5:48 in the morning, the Tareq was positioned at coordinates 24 degrees 38 minutes north, 58 degrees 15 minutes east. This put the submarine exactly 12 miles off the carrier's port beam, a perfect firing position for its primary armament. The Iranian commander whispered a single order, and the weapons officer began the final calculations for a fire control solution. The process was manual and slow, relying on the change in bearing of the target over time to determine its exact speed and distance. They were calculating an intercept for a vessel moving at 20 knots, a target that was currently unaware of the predator in its path. In the forward torpedo room, the crew worked in near darkness to prepare tubes 1 and 2. The heavy steel outer doors were already open, allowing the cold seawater to flood the launching chambers. Inside the tubes sat 2 533mm wake-homing torpedoes, each carrying a warhead of 300 kilograms of high explosives. These weapons were designed specifically to track the turbulent water left behind by a large ship's propellers. Unlike acoustic torpedoes, which could be fooled by decoys, wake-homers were nearly impossible to distract once they locked onto the physical trail of a massive hull. The Iranian commander checked his watch. The Reagan would cross his firing bearing in exactly 4 minutes. He was operating under strict orders from the Naval Command at Bandar Abbas: engage and destroy the primary capital ship of the American strike group if it entered the restricted corridor. The geopolitical stakes were immense, but in the silence of the submarine, the only thing that mattered was the mathematics of the attack. He watched the digital clock on the bulkhead, the seconds ticking away in a slow, rhythmic crawl that seemed to stretch the very fabric of time. The depth of the water at this location was 350 meters, providing plenty of room for the submarine to dive deeper after the attack. The commander had already plotted a getaway course that would take them into the jagged underwater canyons of the Makran Trench. He knew that the moment the torpedoes left the tubes, the Halsey and the Shiloh would turn their full attention toward his position. The survival of his boat and his crew depended on the precision of the strike and the speed of their subsequent disappearance into the deep, dark silence of the ocean floor. As the bearing to the USS Ronald Reagan reached the planned intercept point, the weapons officer looked up and nodded. The fire control solution was green. The target was large, loud, and moving on a predictable course. The Iranian commander took a deep breath. the humid air filling his lungs as he prepared to give the command that would change the course of history in the Persian Gulf. He looked at the sonar display one last time, watching the massive signature of the American carrier as it steamed toward the point of no return. 5:50 in the morning. The sonar shack of the destroyer USS Halsey. Sonar technician second class Miller sat motionless, his fingers hovering over the game controls of the SQS-53C sonar suite. The blue light of the display reflected off his glasses, showing a steady cascade of acoustic data known as the waterfall. For the last 3 hours, he had been staring at the white noise of the ocean, filtering out the constant thrum of the carrier strike group and the distant, low-frequency chugging of commercial tankers. Then, he heard it again. It was a sharp, metallic transient, a sound like a heavy bolt sliding into a groove, followed by the faint, high-pitched whine of a flood valve opening. Inside the sterile, air-conditioned confines of the Combat Information Center, the air seemed to turn cold. Miller adjusted his headset, isolating the frequency, range around 2 kHz. The sound was distinct, originating from a bearing of 280 degrees. It was not a biological sound, and it was certainly not a merchant ship. It was the sound of a torpedo tube being prepared for launch. Miller did not hesitate. He pressed the internal communications button, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline through his chest. Bridge. Sonar. New submerged contact. Sierra 21. Bearing 280. Range estimated at 12,000 yards. Contact classified as probable Kilo-class submarine. Transient suggests weapon door opening. The response from the bridge of the USS Halsey was instantaneous. The all-hands alarm echoed through the steel passageways of the destroyer, a rhythmic, electronic gong that signaled a transition from a state of high readiness to immediate combat. On the bridge, the commanding officer ordered the ship to turn hard to port, bringing the destroyer's bow-mounted sonar array directly toward the bearing of the intruder. The Halsey's 4 gas turbine engines roared to life, pushing the vessel from 20 to 30 knots in a matter of seconds. The hull of the destroyer bucked as it cut through the heavy swells, white spray exploding over the forecastle. 3 miles away, the report was flashed to the USS Ronald Reagan via the Link 16 Tactical Data Network. Inside the carrier's own Combat Direction Center, the symbology on the large screen displays changed instantly. A yellow diamond, indicating an unknown submerged contact, appeared on the western edge of the carrier's screen. Within seconds, it turned red. The carrier's escort commander, a captain with 25 years of experience in anti-submarine warfare, recognized the gravity of the situation. At 12,000 yards, the Iranian submarine was well within the lethal envelope for its wake-homing torpedoes. The environment inside the Reagan shifted from the routine of flight operations to the grim reality of a ship under threat. The general quarters siren wailed throughout the 11 decks of the carrier, a sound that sent thousands of sailors sprinting to their assigned stations. In the hangar bay, the massive steel blast doors were slammed shut, sealing the ship into watertight compartments. The air was filled with the sound of heavy boots on non-skid flooring and the frantic but disciplined shouting of damage control teams. The smell of the sea was replaced by the ozone of high-powered electronics and the faint scent of hydraulic fluid as the ship's defensive systems were brought online. The Halsey began to ping. The active sonar pulses, high-energy bursts of sound, tore through the water like physical hammers. Each ping traveled at 1,500 meters per second, striking the hull of the Iranian submarine and returning as a clear, sharp spike on Miller's screen. The ghost was no longer a ghost. It was a solid, steel-hulled reality. The Halsey was now screaming at the predator, letting the Iranian crew know that they had been found. But the detection had come dangerously late. The math was already working against the Americans. On the Reagan's bridge, the navigator plotted an emergency evasion course. The massive carrier began a ponderous, slow-motion turn toward the south. Its 4 rudders shifted to the maximum angle of 30 degrees. The deck of the carrier began to tilt, the list so pronounced that the sailors on the flight deck had to grab onto tie-down chains to keep from sliding toward the edge. Below the waterline, the carrier's massive hull created a turbulent, churning wake, a physical signature that acted as a beacon for the Iranian weapons. The USS Halsey's commanding officer authorized the deployment of an SQR-19 tactical towed array sonar, a long cable of sensors trailing a mile behind the ship. They were looking for the exact moment of launch. The air above the Gulf of Oman remained dark, the first light of dawn still 20 minutes away. The water between the Halsey and the Reagan was a chaotic mess of acoustic energy, and somewhere in that black expanse, two torpedoes were about to begin their run. The crew of the Halsey prepared to launch an anti-submarine rocket, but the fire control computer flashed a warning. Target within minimum range. The Predator was too close for the rockets to arm. It was now a race of raw speed and desperate decoys. 5:52 in the morning. The dark, pressurized interior of the Iranian submarine Tareq. The Iranian commander gave the final order with a sharp, downward motion of his hand. In the forward torpedo room, the weapons officer pressed the firing studs for tubes 1 and 2. A massive surge of compressed air forced the first 533mm torpedo out of its tube, followed 2 seconds later by the second. The sound inside the submarine was a deafening, metallic thud that shook the deck plates and sent a fine mist of hydraulic fluid into the air. Outside the hull, 2 massive shapes of steel and high explosives accelerated instantly, their twin contra-rotating propellers churning the seawater into a froth of white bubbles. The torpedoes were programmed for a high-speed run at 45 knots, their internal guidance systems ignoring the sonar pings from the USS Halsey. These were wake-homing weapons, designed to seek the specific turbulent signature of a large ship's passage through the water. They ran at a depth of 10 meters, staying just below the surface to avoid detection by visual lookouts, but high enough to strike the carrier's hull where the armor was thinnest. The distance of 12,000 yards would be covered in exactly 8 minutes and 12 seconds. On the USS Ronald Reagan, the torpedo defense alarm replaced the standard general quarters siren. It was a rapid, high-pitched pulsing sound that signaled an immediate and existential threat to the ship. In the carrier's aft section, the winches for the ANSLQ-25 Nixie decoys groaned under the strain as the acoustic lures were deployed into the water. 2 long cables, each over 1,000 feet long, trailed behind the carrier, emitting a loud, rhythmic thrumming designed to mimic the sound of the ship's engines. The goal was to draw the torpedoes away from the hull and toward the decoys. The carrier's 4 massive bronze propellers were now pushing the ship to its maximum speed of 32 knots. The vibration throughout the hull was immense, a deep, bone-shaking roar that made speech difficult on the lower decks. At this speed, the Reagan was creating a massive, churning wake that stretched for miles behind it, a perfect trail for the Iranian torpedoes to follow. The engineering department reported that the temperature in the reactor compartments was rising rapidly, but the orders from the bridge were clear: maintain maximum turns until the threat was neutralized. On the bridge of the USS Halsey, the tactical officer monitored the 2 high-speed underwater tracks on his console. The torpedoes were moving with terrifying precision, ignoring the decoys and staying locked onto the carrier's actual wake. The Halsey's commanding officer ordered the deployment of the 6-barrel Mark 36 decoy launching system. Dozens of small rounds were fired into the air, exploding on the surface and releasing clouds of acoustic chaff and chemical bubbles meant to mask the ship's signature. The air was filled with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt propellant as the launchers fired in rapid succession. Inside the Reagan's Combat Direction Center, the countdown clock on the main wall display showed 6 minutes to impact. The carrier was now in a full emergency turn to starboard, a maneuver designed to cross the T of the incoming torpedoes and present the smallest possible target profile. The ship listed 15 degrees to the left, causing unsecured equipment to slide across the decks. In the mess decks, heavy metal tables groaned against their deck mounts. The crew, many of them wearing fire-retardant flash gear over their faces and hands, braced themselves against the bulkheads, waiting for the impact they hoped would never come. The The escorting cruiser USS Shiloh moved to intercept the path of the torpedoes, a desperate tactic known as taking the hit for the carrier. The Shiloh's commander knew that his ship had a much better chance of surviving a single torpedo strike than the Reagan, which carried millions of gallons of jet fuel and hundreds of tons of ordnance. The cruiser increased its speed to 30 knots, its bow cutting through the dark waves and sending sheets of white water over its radar arrays. The two torpedoes, however, remained locked on the carrier's massive, turbulent wake, ignoring the smaller signature of the cruiser as they closed the final 3 miles. The atmosphere on the Reagan was one of grim, focused determination. There was no panic, only the systematic execution of damage control procedures. The air inside the ship grew hot and stagnant as the ventilation systems were shut down to prevent the spread of smoke in the event of a hit. Every sailor on the ship, from the youngest airman to the most senior officer, knew that the next 5 minutes would determine if the Ronald Reagan would remain a symbol of American power or become a tomb of steel at the bottom of the Gulf of Oman. 5:58 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The distance between the incoming torpedoes and the hull of the USS Ronald Reagan had closed to less than 1,000 yards. On the bridge of the carrier, the ship's tactical officer watched the high-speed tracks on the primary display. The wake-homing torpedoes were ignoring the acoustic decoys trailing behind the ship. They were locked onto the physical turbulence of the carrier's massive, twin-screw wake, following the trail of bubbles and pressure changes with mechanical certainty. The Reagan was now in the final seconds of its emergency starboard turn, the deck tilted at a sharp 12-degree angle, making it difficult for the damage control teams to move through the narrow passageways. The atmosphere inside the carrier's engineering spaces was a chaotic blend of extreme heat and vibrating steel. In the main machinery rooms, the giant steam turbines were screaming at their maximum operating revolutions, pushing the ship to its absolute limit of 32 knots. The deck plates beneath the sailors' feet were hot to the touch, and the air was thick with the smell of heavy lubricating oil and high-pressure steam. Every man was at his station, braced against the bulkheads, their hands gripped on the handrails as the ship's hull groaned under the massive centrifugal forces of the turn. In a desperate attempt to neutralize the threat, the destroyer USS Halsey fired its final defensive measures. 2 anti-torpedo torpedoes were launched from the destroyer's side-mounted tubes, striking the water with a loud splash before accelerating toward the incoming Iranian weapons. These interceptors were designed to find and destroy incoming torpedoes in the water, but the chaotic, turbulent environment created by the carrier's wake made a clean lock nearly impossible. The interceptors passed within meters of the first Iranian torpedo, their proximity fuses failing to detonate in the swirling mass of bubbles and pressure waves. The terminal phase of the engagement had begun. The first Iranian torpedo, a 533mm wakehomer, reached the end of its pursuit. Its internal computer recognized the sudden increase in water pressure and the massive acoustic signature of the carrier's hull directly ahead. The weapon transitioned into its final attack mode, increasing its speed to 50 knots for the final 300 meters. The sound of its contra-rotating propellers became a high-pitched, metallic scream that could be heard through the carrier's hull by the sailors in the lower compartments. The trigger was squeezed inside the torpedo's logic processor. The weapon shrieked through the final 50 yards, a white column of fire and bubbles punching through the dark water. The heat from its internal combustion engine was intense, even in the cold depths of the ocean. The guidance fins adjusted for a final time, aiming for the massive slab of steel just below the Reagan's No. 2 aircraft elevator. There was no time for further decoys, no room for further turns. The weapon was home. The warhead punched straight through the port side armor, 3 meters below the waterline, detonating the 300 kilograms of high explosives against the ship's inner hull. The impact was not a single sound, but a sequence of structural failures. The outer hull plating shattered like glass, followed instantly by a fireball that bleached the dark water white for a fraction of a second. The blast wave tore through the longitudinal bulkheads, shredding the thick steel as if it were paper. The pressure compressed the air in the adjacent fuel tanks, causing an immediate secondary explosion of 2,000 gallons of JP-5 jet fuel. A massive column of seawater and black smoke erupted from the side of the Reagan, rising 60 feet into the air and drenching the flight deck in a rain of salt and oil. The ship shuddered violently, a bone-crushing shockwave that threw men off their feet and sent unsecured equipment flying across the hangars. In the lower compartments, the sound of the detonation cracked eardrums and blew out every light fixture for 300 feet. The hull itself split along the weld seams near frame 180, and the ocean began to pour into the ship at a rate of 10,000 gallons per minute. Black smoke boiled out of the jagged hole in the carrier's side, and the Reagan's forward momentum began to falter. The ship groaned, a deep, metallic sound of overstressed steel that echoed through every deck. The first torpedo had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had broken the ship's watertight integrity and initiated a catastrophic flood in the forward machinery rooms. But the attack was not over. The second torpedo was only 15 seconds behind the first, locked onto the same churning wake and moving with the same lethal intent. 5:59 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The USS Ronald Reagan was reeling from the first impact, a massive shudder still vibrating through the 97,000 tons of steel. On the bridge, the deck was slick with spilled coffee and shattered glass. The list to port had already reached 5 degrees, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy chemical bite of burning jet fuel rising from the lower decks. The internal communication systems were flickering, and the damage control status board was a chaotic mosaic of red lights. But the most immediate threat was still 15 seconds away, screaming through the water at 50 knots. The second Iranian wake-homing torpedo had ignored the debris and the massive air bubble created by the first explosion. Its internal processor remained locked on the primary source of the ship's turbulence, the 4 massive bronze propellers. As the weapon entered its terminal homing phase, the electric motor shifted to its maximum power output. The high-pitched whine of the torpedo's contra-rotating blades became a piercing, metallic shriek that echoed through the Reagan's aft machinery rooms, a sound the sailors there recognized as the voice of their own destruction. The trigger was squeezed inside the torpedo's logic processor for the second time. The weapon shrieked through the final 20 yards of churning water, its steel nose aimed directly for the portside propulsion shaft alley, just aft of the main engineering spaces. The warhead punched straight through the triple-bottom hull plating, the 300 kilograms of high explosives detonating with a force that compressed the water and the steel in a single, catastrophic instant. The impact was a white-hot flash of light that bleached the dark water and turned the seawater into high-pressure steam. The blast wave tore through the main propulsion shaft, a solid column of steel 2 feet in diameter, snapping it like a dry twig. The shaft alley erupted in a fireball of atomized lubricating oil and superheated steam. The explosion drove into the heart of the auxiliary machinery room, shredding the electrical switchboards and the secondary cooling pumps for the No. 2 reactor. The shockwave was so intense, it compressed the chests of the damage control sailors in the adjacent compartment, throwing them against the bulkheads with bone-breaking force. The ship reacted with a violent, sickening lurch to the port side. The Ronald Reagan, which had been fighting to maintain its 20-knot speed, suddenly felt its lifeblood draining away. The loss of the portside propulsion shaft caused the carrier to yaw uncontrollably to the left. The massive rudders, unable to compensate for the sudden asymmetric thrust, below the waterline, a second jagged hole, 15 meters wide, allowed the ocean to roar into the ship's engineering heart. The sound of metal tearing and the roar of the incoming sea drowned out the emergency sirens. The damage control teams, already struggling with the first hit, were swept off their feet by a wall of waist-deep water and oily sludge. In the darkness of the lower decks, illuminated only by the flickering red of emergency lanterns, the Defender Reacts phase was one of raw, desperate survival. Sailors fought to dog down heavy steel hatches against the crushing pressure of the incoming ocean, their hands slick with grease and blood. The ship's list increased rapidly from 5 degrees to 10, then 12. In the hangar bay, A parked FA-18 fighter snapped its tie-down chains and slid across the deck, slamming into a stack of ordnance containers with a shower of sparks. Immediate aftermath was a scene of industrial horror. Thick, black smoke, smelling of burning rubber and chemical fire, poured out of every ventilation trunk on the port side. The Reagan was no longer a symbol of power. It was a wounded giant, its forward momentum dying as the seawater flooded the main machinery rooms. The great humming vibration of the ship's reactors began to wind down into a low, mournful groan. For 3 seconds, there was a dead silence on the bridge, broken only by the crackle of a radio and the distant, muffled sound of a secondary explosion deep in the hull. The Carrier Strike Group commander looked out at the smoke-covered flight deck, his face pale in the dim morning light. The second torpedo had been the killing blow to the ship's mobility. The Reagan was listing 12 degrees, its speed dropping to 5 knots, and its power grid was failing. Across the water, the destroyers of the strike group were already turning, their sonar systems screaming at the unseen predator below. But for the Ronald Reagan, the primary battle for survival had moved from the tactical displays to the very bones of the ship. 6:05 in the morning, the Gulf of Oman. The USS Ronald Reagan was no longer fighting the sea. It was being consumed by it. Inside the primary flight control center, the digital inclinometer showed a steady, sickening crawl toward a 15-degree list to port. Every 3 seconds, the massive ship groaned, a sound of thousands of tons of structural steel twisting and shearing under the weight of the incoming ocean. The general quarters alarm had been replaced by the haunting, low-frequency pulse of the abandoned ship preparation siren, though the order had not yet been given. The air in the upper decks was thick with the acrid, yellow smoke of burning electrical insulation, and the smell of atomized seawater. In the depths of the ship, the situation was catastrophic. The second torpedo had effectively severed the port-side propulsion shaft, allowing high-pressure water to bypass the primary seals and flood the main machinery, room number 2. The engineering officer of the watch made the split-second decision to execute an emergency scram of the A4W nuclear reactors. Control rods were slammed into the reactor cores, halting the nuclear chain reaction in seconds to prevent a meltdown as the cooling pumps lost power. The sudden loss of the main electrical bus dropped the ship into a terrifying, red-lit darkness, illuminated only by the flickering beams of handheld battle lanterns. 3 miles to the west, the crew of the destroyer USS Halsey had witnessed the 2 massive geysers of water and smoke erupt from the side of their carrier. The shock of seeing the Reagan wounded transformed instantly into a cold, professional fury. The Halsey's commanding officer stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the sonar display, where the Iranian submarine Tareq was attempting to dive deep into the Makran Trench. The submarine was at a depth of 150 meters, moving at 15 knots as it sought the safety of the jagged underwater canyons. The Halsey was now operating its AN/SQS-53C sonar in continuous wave mode, a high-energy acoustic search that hammered the submarine's hull with unrelenting pulses of sound. At coordinates 24 degrees 40 minutes north, 58 degrees 10 minutes east, the destroyer's fire control computer achieved a Grade 1 weapon lock. The tactical officer confirmed the solution, and the order was given to prosecute the target with every available asset. The destroyer's forward Mark 41 vertical launch system covers snapped open with a series of metallic cracks. The trigger was squeezed for the American response. 2 RUM-139 anti-submarine rockets, or ASROCs, shrieked out of their cells. The missiles punched through the morning mist on twin columns of white-hot fire, their solid fuel motors roaring as they accelerated to Mach 1 in less than 4 seconds. The heat from the launch scorched the gray paint on the Halsey's deck, and the smell of nitrate and burnt rubber filled the air. These were not mere torpedoes. They were carrier-delivered death sentences, designed to fly over the water and drop their payloads directly on top of the enemy's last known position. 5 miles away, the rockets reached their calculated release point. The airframes split apart, and 2 Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes were deployed via parachute. They hit the water with a sharp splash, shed their flight gear, and activated their high-frequency active sonar seekers. These weapons were far more advanced than the Iranian wakehomers. They used digital signal processing to filter out decoys and terrain, locking onto the specific resonance of the Kilo-class submarine's pressure hull. The two Mark 54 torpedoes began a high-speed spiral dive, their electric motors whining at 3,000 revolutions per minute as they searched for the Tareq. Inside the Iranian submarine, the commander heard the parachutes hit the surface. He knew his boat was too slow to outrun the American airdropped weapons. He ordered the deployment of acoustic jammers and 3 Shako decoys, which emitted loud, simulated engine noises to confuse the incoming seekers. The Tareq was now at a depth of 200 meters, the hull creaking under the massive pressure of the deep water. The Iranian crew sat in total silence, some praying, others staring at the depth gauge as the high-pitched pinging of the American torpedoes grew louder and faster, sounding like a metallic hammer striking a steel anvil. On the USS Ronald Reagan, the list had reached 18 degrees. The flight deck, once the most active 4 acres in the world, was now a treacherous slope. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets, their tie-downs failing under the extreme angle, slid slowly toward the port edge. The first aircraft reached the side, its nose gear snapping as it tipped over the catwalk and plummeted into the churning, oily water below. The splash was swallowed by the roar of the fire and the scream of escaping steam from the carrier's ruptured bypass valves. The giant was falling, and the only question remaining was how many of its 5,000 sailors would go down with it. 6:08 in the morning, 220 meters below the surface of the Gulf of Oman. The 2 American Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes had successfully filtered out the noise of the Iranian decoys. Their high-frequency active sonar seekers were now locked on to the solid steel mass of the Tareq's pressure hull, which reflected the sound pulses with the clarity of a bell. The torpedoes transitioned into their terminal homing phase, their electric motors whining at 4,000 revolutions per minute, as they accelerated to a speed of 45 knots. The sound inside the Iranian submarine was no longer a rhythmic ping. It was a continuous, high-pitched, metallic shriek that vibrated through the very bones of the 52 sailors trapped inside. The trigger was squeezed inside the first torpedo's logic processor as it reached a distance of 10 meters. The warhead punched clean through the outer hydrodynamic casing and into the forward torpedo room of the Tareq. The 90 kilograms of high explosives detonated, with a force that was instantly magnified by the immense external water pressure. The impact was not a slow collapse, but a violent, structural shattering. The forward bulkhead was driven backward into the crew quarters, shredding the steel bunks and the electrical conduits in a single, catastrophic millisecond. A fireball erupted inside the hull for a fraction of a second before the ocean followed the explosion. A wall of water moving at 300 meters per second. The heat from the detonation was so intense it scorched the interior paint, but the cooling effect of the incoming sea was instantaneous and absolute. The Iranian sailors in the command center had less than 2 seconds to react. The commander reached for the emergency ballast blow valve, his face illuminated by the white-hot flash of the breach. But the pressure hull was already failing along its primary weld seams. The Tareq reacted with a sickening, downward pitch of 45 degrees. The submarine did not rise. It was driven toward the bottom by the weight of the water, flooding its forward compartments. The internal lighting failed instantly, leaving the crew in a terrifying, pressurized darkness filled with the sound of screaming metal and the roar of the incoming ocean. The second Mark 54 torpedo followed the first into the breach, detonating amidships and effectively snapping the 1,000-ton submarine in half. The pressure hull, designed to withstand the crushing weight of the deep, finally succumbed, imploding with a sound that was heard on the sonar arrays of the USS Halsey 5 miles away as a single, low-frequency thud. The immediate aftermath was a scene of silent, underwater desolation. The two halves of the Tareq, trailing clouds of diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and debris, began their final descent into the 3,000-meter depths of the Makran Trench. A few air bubbles, the last breath of the Iranian vessel, rose to the surface, but there were no survivors. The ocean, which had provided the submarine with its stealth and its lethality, now claimed it entirely. On the sonar screens of the American strike group, the red contact symbol for Sierra 21 flickered once, then vanished into the black. On the bridge of the USS Halsey, sonar technician Miller removed his headphones. He had heard the breaking up noises, the sound of a submarine dying. It was a rhythmic sequence of sharp cracks and groans as the internal bulkheads collapsed one by one under the pressure. He reported the kill to the commanding officer. But there was no cheering in the Combat Information Center. Every man in the room was looking at the secondary display where the icon for the USS Ronald Reagan was still listed as Condition Red, catastrophic damage. The environment above the water had changed as the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, and the smoke from the carrier was a black pillar that rose thousands of feet into the air, visible for 50 miles. The Halsey turned away from the grave of the Tareq and began a high-speed run toward the carrier. The mission of the escort was no longer to protect the Reagan from a predator, but to save as many of its sailors as possible before the great ship disappeared beneath the waves. 6:15 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The deck of the USS Ronald Reagan was now tilted at a catastrophic angle of 25 degrees to port. On the bridge, the commanding officer stood with his boots wedged against the base of the command chair to maintain his footing. The ship had lost all primary and backup electrical power 45 minutes after the second impact. The only light came from the dim, red glow of chemical light sticks cracked by the sailors and the harsh orange glare of fires burning uncontrolled in the hangar bay. The ship was no longer a living machine. It was a dead weight of steel, and the ocean was winning the battle for its buoyancy. The commanding officer picked up the battery-powered emergency megaphone. His voice was steady, carried by the discipline of 30 years of service in the United States Navy, but the words were the hardest any captain could ever utter. He gave the order: abandon ship. Abandon ship. All hands, proceed to your assigned muster stations. This is not a drill. Throughout the 11 decks, a haunting sound that signaled the end of the Reagan's 23-year career. The evacuation was a masterpiece of professional logistics under extreme duress. 5,000 sailors, airmen, and Marines began a systematic movement toward the high side of the ship, the starboard rail. Because of the extreme list, the standard lifeboats on the port side were already submerged or pinned against the hull. The crew relied on the inflatable life rafts stored in canisters along the starboard catwalks. One by one, the canisters were released, hitting the water and inflating into bright orange hexagons, each capable of holding 25 personnel. The air around the carrier was filled with the deafening roar of MH-60 Sierra helicopters. 6 of these aircraft, belonging to the Black Knights of Helicopter Sea Combat Squadron 4, were hovering in the thick, black smoke. They used their rescue hoists to pluck injured sailors from the flight deck and the sponsons. The pilots navigated through a graveyard of floating debris and the intense heat rising from the internal fires. The smell of the environment was an overwhelming mix of vaporized hydraulic fluid, burnt rubber, and the raw, cold salt of the sea. To the east, the destroyer USS Halsey and the cruiser USS Shiloh moved to within 500 yards of the sinking giant. This was a dangerous maneuver, as the suction of a sinking carrier could potentially pull smaller vessels down or cause collisions with floating wreckage. The Halsey deployed its fleet of rigid-hull inflatable boats, the small, high-speed craft darting between the whitecaps to pull shivering sailors from the water. The sea was running 3-meter swells, and the temperature of the water was 22 degrees, not cold enough for immediate hypothermia, but enough to sap the strength of a swimmer in less than an hour. Below the flight deck, in the darkness of the mess decks and berthing areas, the purple K-dry chemical fire suppressants hung in the air like a ghostly fog. Damage control teams, their breathing apparatuses nearly empty, were the last to leave. They moved through the slanted passageways, checking every compartment for trapped shipmates. They found men pinned by shifted machinery and guided them toward the emergency escape trunks. The sound of the ship was constant, a deep, rhythmic thrumming of water rushing into empty spaces, and the sharp, gunshot-like reports of internal bulkheads failing under the pressure. By 6:45 in the morning, the Reagan's flight deck was nearly awash. The 4 massive catapults were now slanted toward the seabed. The towering island structure, the brain of the ship, leaned precariously over the water. The giant 76 painted on the side was partially obscured by a thick coating of black oil and soot. Thousands of sailors were now in the water or packed into life rafts, watching in a stunned, respectful silence as their home began its final plunge. The logistics of the rescue were reaching their peak. The Halsey and Shiloh were now over capacity, their decks crowded with hundreds of survivors wrapped in gray wool blankets. The medical teams on the escorts worked frantically to treat cases of smoke inhalation, broken limbs, and chemical burns. Despite the chaos, the accountability of the crew was maintained using manual rosters. The United States Navy was proving its resilience, even in the face of its greatest modern loss. The sun was now fully above the horizon, casting a bright, unforgiving light. On the oil slick that stretched for 3 miles behind the dying carrier, the Reagan gave one final, long groan. As the internal air pockets finally burst, the stern began to rise into the air, exposing the 4 massive bronze propellers that had once pushed the ship across the globe. They stood like silent monuments against the morning sky for 10 seconds, before the weight of the flooded bow pulled the ship forward. The water rushed over the flight deck, swallowing the remaining aircraft, and the island structure in a massive, churning whirlpool of white foam and black smoke. 7 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The surface of the sea, once dominated by the 97,000 tons of American steel that was the USS Ronald Reagan, was now a chaotic graveyard of floating wreckage and thick, black oil. The morning sun, bright and unforgiving, illuminated a slick that stretched for over 5 miles, shimmering with the iridescent colors of vaporized jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. In the center of this desolation, thousands of orange life rafts bobbed in the 3-meter swells, appearing like a scattered trail of confetti against the dark, iron-gray water. On the crowded decks of the destroyer USS Halsey and the cruiser USS Shiloh, the process of accounting for the survivors was systematic and grim. The final muster was conducted by hand, with department heads shouting names over the roar of helicopter engines and the constant spray of the sea. The results were flashed back to the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain via secure satellite link. Out of a total crew of 5,200 personnel, the final tally of the engagement was 214 confirmed killed in action. 452 sailors were listed as wounded, many suffering from severe smoke inhalation, compound fractures from the internal explosions, or chemical burns from the leaking fuel. The material loss to the United States Navy was staggering, representing the single greatest naval catastrophe since the Second World War. The sinking of the Ronald Reagan resulted in the total loss of 65 high-performance aircraft. This included 48 FA, 18 Super Hornet fighters, 6 EA-18 Gulf Growler electronic warfare planes, 4 E-2 Delta Hawkeye early warning aircraft, and 7 MH-60 Sierra helicopters. Additionally, 13,000 tons of ordnance and over 3 million gallons of JP-5 jet fuel went to the bottom, creating an environmental hazard that would persist for decades. The strategic objective of the Iranian Naval Command at Bandar Abbas had been achieved, but the cost to their own forces was absolute. The Kilo-class submarine Tareq was confirmed destroyed, along with its entire crew of 52 sailors. The vessel had been torn apart by the 2 Mark 54 torpedoes launched from the USS Halsey, its remains settling in the 3,000-meter depths of the Makran Trench. While the Iranian government initially claimed a total victory, the loss of one of their most capable underwater assets severely degraded their ability to challenge American surface movements in the long term. Within 12 hours of the sinking, the geopolitical landscape of the Persian Gulf had shifted violently. The United States National Command Authority ordered 2 additional carrier strike groups, the USS Gerald R. Ford and the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, to accelerate their transit toward the North Arabian Sea. The Fifth Fleet declared a total exclusion zone covering 5,000 square miles of the Gulf of Oman, authorizing the use of lethal force against any Iranian surface or submerged contact that approached the salvage and recovery operations. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed to commercial traffic as insurance rates for oil tankers tripled in a single afternoon. The logistics of the recovery mission were immense. Hospital ships were dispatched from Naval Station Rota in Spain, and a fleet of heavy-lift transport aircraft began moving thousands of tons of medical supplies and replacement equipment into regional bases in Oman and the United Arab Emirates. The survivors of the Reagan, many still covered in the oil and soot of their ship's final moments, were slowly transferred to larger transport vessels for the long journey home. The psychological impact on the United States Navy was profound, triggering a massive reevaluation of carrier defense doctrines and the vulnerability of capital ships to diesel-electric submarine threats. As the sun reached its zenith over the coordinates 24 degrees north, 58 degrees east, the last of the orange life rafts was hauled aboard the USS Halsey. The destroyer turned its bow toward the south, its engines vibrating with a low, mournful hum as it left the debris field behind. There was no ceremony, no music, only the professional silence of a crew that had seen the impossible occur. The USS Ronald Reagan now rested on the seabed, a tomb of steel and a permanent reminder of the lethality of modern naval warfare. The campaign report concluded that while the strike group had successfully neutralized the immediate threat, the operational cost had redefined American naval strategy for the 21st century. The Reagan was gone, but the Fifth Fleet remained, its remaining ships now operating under the most restrictive rules of engagement in their history. The silence between reloads had begun, and the world watched with held breath as the two nations prepared for the inevitable escalation that would follow the death of a giant.